Blessed love, and welcome to Things You Will Ignore in Florida History, hosted by Mr. Peterson, aka Coach Pete. Today we'll be talking about From Great Experiment to Jackson's White Republic. Alright, so let's talk about the expansion and let's look at a timeline. America declares its independence on July 4th, 1776. However, the Constitution isn't ratified until 1787. 28 years after declaring its independence, the United States doubles its size by purchasing Louisiana. The Missouri Compromise allows Maine and Missouri to become states 44 years after America declares its independence. And then, 47 years after America declares its independence, the Monroe Doctrine is issued, which basically says, Europe, you're no longer allowed to colonize the Americas. The Great Experiment. The Great Experiment is this idea of democracy. And this idea of democracy was not something that was new to the Americas, right? Native Americans actually had organizations that were centered upon this idea of democracy. It is said that the U.S. government borrowed many of these ideals in their formulation of the United States Constitution. Whereas there are many similarities, this chart kind of looks at some differences. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy, the plan for government was unwritten, so then much more focus is going to be given on your word. And you can see some of the other differences as well. Now, though the United States had gained its independence from England in 1783, the document that truly bound the former colonies as states was not ratified until 1787. This is what we call the United States Constitution. It included a Bill of Rights in order to be ratified. Within that Bill of Rights, there was an amendment that protected militia groups that were separate from colonial militaries of each colony. These militia groups were used to wage war on non-combatants, attack and kill Native Americans, and also patrol slaves. The Muskegee, they're also called the Creek. They were made up of several tribes that occupied Georgia and Alabama in the American colonial period. Right? They were one of the 5 civilized tribes. They were also the subject of war with the United States. In the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which we read about when we looked at our New Zealand article, this shows and highlights some of the important facts of that article. We also must note that in Tennessee, Andrew Jackson and his fighters took on Native Americans, and they did have Native American allies. One of the things that we learned from the article was how Europeans were good at exploiting the divisions that were already present in populations that they were colonizing. And so since the Creeks had already had some divisions within them, they already had some infighting per se. Jackson and his Tennessee fighters were able to get Native Americans as their allies, and during the quote-unquote Battle of Horseshoe Bend were able to overtake the Red Sticks. However, as we read, this was really much different than any battle that we would really call a battle. This was more of a massacre. The Treaty of Fort Jackson was quote-unquote signed on August 9th, 1814. Jackson forces both the lower and the upper creeks to sign and secede 23 million acres of land. So this figure, Andrew Jackson, this Indian fighter, right, as we learned many different facts about Andrew Jackson as we watched our video, RGQVL, that dealt with the 7th president. He was a quote-unquote war hero, and as we have found out that many of these wars that people are heroes of are battles and massacres of indigenous people of America. Andrew Jackson, his parents were of Scots-Irish. All right, they came to the United States in 1765. Well, the colonies in 1765. A few weeks before his birth, in 1767, Andrew Jackson's father was killed in a logging accident. This left his mother and 2 older brothers to kind of fend for him, and all 3 of them died during the American Revolutionary War. Andrew Jackson was an orphan at 13 years. He studied law and he was admitted into the Western District of North Carolina, which we now call Tennessee. He was the wealthy owner of a slave work plantation called the Hermitage. And in 1801, he took control over the Tennessee militia as colonel and began his Indian killing career. And there we have the connection once again to our Newsela article dealing with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The U.S. waged 3 wars against Seminole Nation from 1817 to 1858, with Jackson as a major general in the first one. So he wanted to be called general and not Mr. President because his whole ideology, his practice, as we have seen, was waging war against the indigenous people of America. And this idea, this democracy that was brought for the common man, as we read in another one of our Newsela articles, that this idea of democracy was good for the common man, but only if we look at the common man as if they are white. All right. Now, if you remember from our previous module in phase, where we talked about the convent and the covenant, we talked about European activism and how the ideology of white supremacy as it was brought to America has its roots in this ideology of European activism. Right here you have Andrew Jackson and his democracy, right, pretending to be for common people when really it was just for white men, right? Now, as more white men gained this power to vote, right, they also stripped, by them gaining these powers, they also stripped blacks and Native Americans and Hispanics of theirs by considering all of those people less than. This legacy of Indian fighting, of white supremacy, right, it followed Andrew Jackson from the hand-picked president of Martin Van Buren to Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison. The ideology of white supremacy and, more importantly, the governmental policy of Native American genocide followed the presidents. Through the expansion of James K. Polk and another general rough and ready Zachary Taylor. And as we learned from the GQS on the 14th and 15th presidents, balance was needed, peace was needed. And so Franklin Pierce was elected, and then James Buchanan, who hastened the upcoming civil war. The nation is divided. There is a division that looms. However, the nation is united under one thing. Native American land will be taken. The division comes, will these new territories be admitted as free or slave states? This has been another production from one of the dopest teachers ever, Mr. Peterson, aka Coach Pete. Blessed love.